Alright everybody, hello, this is AW, here with Hyperion and Chaya. And today we're continuing Marx's philosophic manuscripts from 1844, Private Property and Communism. Um, I'll link to part 1 somewhere in the video or in the descriptions. You figure it out, my channel is not full yet. Can't miss it. So last time we read section 1, which is basically about a version of communism which was a crude communism of envy, which was a communism of leveling down, a communism of subsistence, living, a communism of a generalized, universalized private property, which ended up really destroying the very concept of private property, not in a good way, but in a bad way. Leaving you with everything bad about private property with none of the good. And one of the main things that I got from that one was that one of the implications from what Marx states early on in the piece concerning what he says the very beginning at the top of the page, where he says the antithesis between lack of property and property, so long as it is not comprehended as the antithesis of labor and capital, still remains an indifferent antithesis, not grasped in its active connection, in its internal relation, not yet grasped as a contradiction. And so what I mentioned last time, that I thought this fundamentally means, and if one takes it seriously, fundamentally commits one to, is the denial of private property in total, with no stops whatsoever. No room for so-called, oh, but you can have personal property. No. Here the implication is that if you have private property, you've got the foundations of capital, and so you have all the requirements of alienation and the generation of the alienation of capitalism. And in a way that makes sense, in that having property is the condition for having commodities, and having commodities is the condition for commodity exchange, and having commodity exchange is the condition for markets, and markets are the condition for an eventual necessity for the production of commodities, the interconnection of society in a system of dependencies in which people must produce for others in order to satisfy themselves. Which is a very dialectical thing, and sounds actually quite nice and beautiful in abstract. Sounds something very much like what Marx himself seems to want. But its reality is quite contradictory indeed. And by the way, just an autistic point, if there is a contradiction to property, it is the contradiction of property opposed to property. Same thing with the contradiction of commodities. The contradiction of commodity is actually that it is self-opposed to itself, in relation to itself. Commodity exchanges only for a commodity. It is self-contradictory. Its whole existence is to not exist because it must move, it must cease to be itself. Dialectics. So, another comment on that is the contradiction of property, therefore, is not the contradiction of labor and capital, as much as Marx wants to identify that in this passage. That's not really true in a logical sense. So, moving to part 2, so scroll down. Little number 2. Communism, alpha, still political in nature, democratic or despotic. Beta, with the abolition of the state, yet still incomplete and being still affected by private property, that is, by the estrangement of man. In both forms, communism already is aware of being reintegration or return of man to himself, the transcendence of human self-estrangement, but since it has not yet grasped the positive essence of private property, and just as little the human nature of need, it remains captive to it and infected by it. It has indeed grasp its concept, but not its essence. So this is talking about a second form of communism as opposed to the first form, the communism of envy. And the fact that this is a really tiny paragraph is really, really stringing the meaning of what the hell this is actually talking about. So the second form of communism is a communism which is still political in nature, can be democratic or despotic, interestingly. Which is, so by the way, for your fucking left comps, haha, take that. Of course, you'll probably say, well, we don't really care. We don't stand by the 1844 manuscripts, in which case, haha, fuck you. Because most of you really love the 1844 manuscripts, except for when it doesn't fit your needs. So it's democratic or despotic. Beta with the abolition of the state, yet still incomplete and being still affected by private property, that is, by the estrangement of man. So here, the abolition of the state can only mean, I assume, the abolition of class oppression, since by this time, apparently, class is being eradicated. So therefore, technically, there is no state. But the fact that there's politics and government, is another thing according to Marxists, even though I think that's obviously a state, but that's just plain semantics for now. So it's still incomplete and being still affected by private property, by the estrangement of man. So this seems it would probably be something that one could say apply to the Soviet Union, so-called, where some people claimed that class warfare was over in the USSR after a while. We crushed the capitalists, we destroyed the kulaks. We're all proletarians, or at least government functionaries. So no class distinctions, no state, technically. But still, a government, still a sort of technocratic control of distribution, the economy. So the state owns. One could say that the state owns everything, or the communes own everything. In which case, each commune owns its own things. In which case, you still have forms of private property. Because whether it is private property in the sense which state owns everything, that is a form of private property. The individual citizen is excluded from having whole ownership in that, or really having a say in that for the most part. Though one could just claim, you have democratic representations in which you have an indirect way of having a say in how things go. Although that doesn't really seem to make sense, quite really. So by virtue of having private property, we still have the estrangement of man. And by virtue of having this division of labor, we still have the estrangement of man. So he says, in both forms, communism already is aware of being reintegration or return of man to himself, the transcendence of human self-estrangement, but since it has not yet grasped the positive essence of private property, and just as little the human nature of need, it remains captive to it and infected by it. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the positive essence of private property is. No, that can't be what he means. There are essays prior to this in which he goes into stuff like this. Maybe he elaborates further on this. So, yeah, we'll leave that for another moment. And so, in just a little of the human nature of need. So I suppose that it's producing for need, but it's not yet producing in the artistic form that Marx seems to idealize in the other things that I know he's written, in which Marx sees production as an expression of human essence. It's kind of I think it pretty much perfectly analogizes to what we normally consider now art, in which art is an expression of human essence. It's expression of the individual. So therefore, the work that any human individual does, supposedly in communism, is basically each and everything a work of art. And under this second communism, though one could assume that production has been rationalized, that need is being met, it is not yet specifically human need in the sense of work that's being done as an artistic expression of the individual. So it is still not yet fully positive in the essence of private property, whatever that may mean. So he says it remains captive to it and affected by it. So he says it has indeed grasped its concept, but not its essence. By which I don't. I don't know what he means because this can't be in a Hegelian sense. Um, Maybe they understand the end, but they don't understand its real. They haven't realized it. So I remember like listening to Winfield's lectures on this, and Winfield says he doesn't know what the hell the difference is between the second and the first because there's. I mean, the only thing that's missing is the viewpoints, and I mean, obviously there's a difference. Like, it's not a communism at envy yet. It's not a. It's not based on this. If everybody can't have it, then no one can have it. Kind of the idea that the first one has, but it's not really a positive difference so much as a negative difference. This second communism doesn't have what those aspects of the first communism, but functionally it seems to just be kind of the same. So now a third type of communism. Communism as the positive transcendence of private property, as human self-estrangement, and therefore as the real appropriation of the human essence by and for man. Communism, therefore, as the complete return of man to himself as a social, that is, human being. A return accomplished consciously in embracing the entire wealth of previous development. This communism, as fully developed naturalism, equals humanism, and as fully developed humanism equals naturalism. It is the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature and between man and man, the true resolution of the strife between existence and essence, between objectification and self-confirmation, between freedom and necessity, between the individual and the species. Communism as the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be this communism. So, a pretty speculative piece, which is super idealist. But what do you guys think? Gents and Jews alike? Um, maybe they're they're kind of presented as three possible forms in which communism could be understood. I don't. Yeah, it doesn't seem. Yeah, it doesn't seem like a stages kind of thing, even though one can plausibly interpret it that way. I think, in which the first one it would be a communism, which is it's an abstract communism. Then the second one is a more determinate communism, which kind of knows what it's aiming at, but it doesn't know how to realize it. And the third one is it knows what it's aiming at. It's got the concept and the essence as well. It knows, and by essence here, I am assuming the reality of the thing, which I think by concept Marx is alluding to just our regular idea of concepts, which is we have the vague shape of it, the vague form, but not the concrete details, which are the essential aspect. So, three, communism as the positive transcendence of private property, as human self-estrangement, and therefore as the real appropriation of the human essence by and for man. Communism, therefore, as complete return of man to himself as social being, a return accomplished consciously and embracing the entire wealth of previous development. So, he's kind of going by he's trying to follow this pseudo-Hegelian idea, like kind of the phenomenology where, spirit alienates itself and then eventually returns it to itself, where spirit knows itself as spirit. So communism is here the realization of in which it must go through this history of self-estrangement through private property, the different forms of private property, up to the final most rationalized form, which is capitalism. And then there we have the final negation of negation, in which the whole thing is seemingly negated as a backdrop of the history of the coming to be of communism, but where communism is something positive, which is completely new. And I think this is something Marx never lets go. Where that was it was it was it's the what is this usually called, the Hölderlin paradigm, in which this was a very eschatological viewpoint of Marx. So, this communism is fully developed naturalism equals humanism, as fully developed humanism equals naturalism. It is a genuine resolution of conflict between man and nature, between man and man. So, alienation is defeated at the end. Yeah, the true resolution of the strife between existence and essence, which, this particular paragraph just shows here Marx is making a comprehension of this whole issue as one that mirrors not Hegel's logic, but Hegel's phenomenology spirit. Because only in Hegel's phenomenology spirit do you have something that appears to be this way, in which spirit begins self-alienated in natural consciousness, goes through the whole gamut of natural consciousness, develops it to its radical breaking point, and then realizes, oh, this was all wrong. And so there's an assumption in the form in which people think that there is a divergence between the essence and the existence of it, in which in the phenomenology, the existence has the different forms of natural consciousness are in contradiction with the essence, which is actually absolute knowing. And so there is so Hegel sees it as a necessary beginning in self-alienation, in which we had to begin with this self-alienation out of necessity in order to get drawn back towards the essence and finally realizing it and no longer being alienated in that form. And so in that sense, it makes sense that he's structuring it this way. The thing is, of course, once he gets to capital, we find, unfortunately, that capital does not function according to the logic of the phenomenology, but rather to the logic of the logic, the science of logic, in which this is not what happens. There is no alienated self-transcendence. anymore. It is all a positive self-concretizing, which leads nowhere but to itself, and any transcendence of it necessarily includes it, not as a history, but as a component in its own function. So this is one of the ways in which Marx misunderstands Hegel and misappropriates him, because communism is not the sublation and can never be the sublation of capitalism, no matter what anyone else says. And so in that sense, I always I think that Marxists who just throw away Hegel and say, okay, we can't use this, are the better for it, in that they're more intellectually honest than ones who think that it can be used that way when it really can't. So anyways, the third form of communism, the realization of communism, pretty utopian, pretty abstract. Really, it's kind of Marx thinking about this in general terms, in a bad sense, in which he's really thinking negatively. If the whole issue is alienation, well, communism is the answer to alienation. So every problem of alienation is solved in communism. Who knew? Yeah, so communism is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be the solution. Yeah. So, yeah, there's this section 4, which I don't think is a new kind of communism, but it's more of a comment on 3. Continuing, the entire movement of history, just as its, that is, communism's, actual act of genesis, the birth act of its empirical existence, is therefore, for its thinking consciously comprehended and known process of its becoming. What do you know? It's spirit that knows itself. Whereas the still immature communism seeks an historical proof for itself, a proof in the realm of what already exists among disconnected historical phenomena opposed to private property, tearing single phases from the historical process and focusing attention on them as proofs of its historical pedigree, a hobby horse ridden hard, especially by Cabet, Villegardel, etc. By so doing, it simply makes clear that by far the greater part of this process contradicts its own claim, and that if it has ever existed, precisely its being in the past refutes its pretension to reality. So that last 2 sentences, whereas the still mature communism seeks an historical proof for itself, a proof in the realm of what it really exists. He says he's critiquing people who are trying to justify communism by going back to either primitive communism in a state of nature, that is, that we are naturally communist beings, are stupid. That's what Marx is saying. They're trying to justify communism by looking in the past, but he says, by so doing, it simply makes clear that by far the greater part of this process contradicts its own claim, and that if it has ever existed, precisely its being in the past refutes its pretension to reality. So the fact that it doesn't exist shows how good this so-called primitive communism was, and how much we loved it. So how much we should be trying to ape it in any way. So it's a bit of anti-romanticism in that sense. So continuing, it is easy to see that the entire revolutionary movement necessarily finds both its empirical and its theoretical basis in the movement of private property, more precisely in that of the economy. This material, immediately perceptible private property is the material perceptible expression of estranged human life. Its movement, production, and consumption is the perceptible revelation of the movement of all production until now, that is, the realization or the reality of man. Religion, family, state, law, morality, science, art, etc. are only particular modes of production and fall under its general law. The positive transcendence of private property as the appropriation of human life is therefore the positive transcendence of all estrangement, that is to say, the return of man from religion, family, state, etc., to his human, that is, social existence. Religious estrangement as such occurs only in the realm of consciousness of man's inner life, but economic estrangement is that of real life. Its transcendence therefore embraces both aspects. It is evident that the initial stage of the movement among the various peoples depends on whether the true recognized life of the people manifests itself more in the consciousness or in the external world, is more ideal or real. Communism begins from the outset uh, with atheism. Apparently this is copying something from, I think, Robert Owen. But atheism is at first far from being communism. Indeed, that atheism is still mostly an abstraction. So I think here is something rather interesting in that what Marx means by the social essence of humanity, is not what immediately would make sense to us, I think. In that, okay, the stuff about material production, in strange human life, its movement, production, and consumption is the perceptible revolution, the movement of all production, so now, blah, blah, blah. And that seems to make sense. The realization of the reality of man, that stuff that goes with the alienation of labor, the product of labor, blah, blah, blah. But here is interesting. Religion, family, state, law, morality, science, art, etc. are only particular modes of production and fall under its general law. And that just seems so unreal and ahistorical when one really delves into the details of what religion, family, state, law, morality, science, art really are. He says they're only particular modes of production. Obviously Marx always here privileges production, material production, ways of producing, as the ultimate category. But really, can we really say that religion is somehow, just a particular mode of production? Can we really say that family is really a particular mode of production? State, law, morality, science, art, etc. I think that's just blatantly insane to think that it is. Yeah, that totally dismisses one of the aspects of religion, which is indeed a form of alienation, but it's not an alienation of production. Religion, I think there's plenty of evidence to show that religion also originates as is basic human need for understanding themselves and the world and the way they relate to that world. The very word religion, is I think like Latin religare, which is to be tied back to the source. The source of truth, the source of what? Well, whatever it is that the world really is. Whatever it's for. Whatever the truth is. Whether it's God, whether one thinks about it as the one of pantheism. It doesn't matter. Religion isn't fundamentally a mode of production. It doesn't make sense. Religion is fundamentally a way of self-understanding. It's a way of coming to terms with oneself and the world. Likewise, the family is not a particular mode of production. The family is, yes, a unit that happens to produce, but even nowadays, where you don't rely on your direct family anymore, for the most part, in the modern day, ideally, for your subsistence, and yet the family still exists. Why? Well, because the family isn't just a mode of production. The family is this emotional need. It's a psychological need. It's a human need. It is really a social need. And the family isn't just the people you're born with and live with. They're your friends. They can be your neighbors, etc. So it's something social that is beyond just labor and production. The state as well legislates things which have nothing to do with production. They can legislate morality, they can legislate crimes, they can legislate all these things which have nothing to do with the regulation of material production whatsoever. Law, morality, the same thing. Morality can't be an estrangement of particular modes of production. That makes no sense whatsoever. Science as well. Science begins with rich people sitting on their ass who are just fucking curious. Like seriously, it's just a curiosity to know. which only, by the time of the Enlightenment becomes an instrumental curiosity. Originally, it was a curiosity for its own sake, the desire to know just for the sake of knowing. And art, in the same way, art is not a particular mode of production. Art happens to be expressed in a production, and it can itself be expressed in a production, in the producing of production, for example, like dance, singing, etc., in an activity. But it also isn't just done for the sake of production. It's just done because, one desires to do it for its own sake. One takes an aesthetic pleasure in it. So that seems to make no sense to me whatsoever. It's an unwarranted reduction, and it's illogical, really. But of course, what labor is for Marx seems to go beyond what we normally consider by labor. But even then, with what I know, and I will admit here, I can't remember much detail on this right now, it doesn't seem like it would make sense. So he also says, continuing reading, that the positive transcendence of private property as the appropriation of human life is therefore the positive transcendence of all estrangement, that is to say, the return of man from religion, family, state, etc., to his human, that is, social existence. And that's the sentence I was talking about earlier. I mentioned earlier that if you really think about it, that seems utterly insane. That doesn't make sense. How in the world is religion, family, and state and morality not the very social existence of humanity? How can there be a social existence that isn't expressed in those? That if we really had our social essence, that we would be without those. What in the world does that mean? Like, that's insane to me. I mean, those things are our very sociality. They are our social existence. They are that very essence expressed. It's not that these are hiding that essence. No, they are that very essence expressed. May not be expressed in the best way, but they are certainly expressions of and they are realities of that social existence. To abstract that social existence away from those seems to me utterly mad, and just completely misunderstanding what sociality really is. Because here it seems Marx thinks that sociality apparently has nothing social about it. It seems to be such this essential thing within all human individuals, abstracted from real society, which seems utterly against the very tenets of what Marxists claim, which is, materialism, the real existence of things. But yeah, thoughts on this? I mean, does it seem strange to both of you as well? Yeah, apparently. Yeah, because the denial of these very institutions themselves is basically a denial of sociality. I mean, how can you have a social human being without these, really? Yeah, so to have sociality without these things is utterly bizarre. And yeah, I don't know. And so, continuing, religious estrangement as such occurs only in the realm of consciousness, of man's inner life, but economic estrangement is that of real life. Its transcendence, therefore, embraces both aspects. It is evident that the initial stage of the movement amongst the various peoples depends on whether the true recognized life of the people manifests itself more in consciousness or in the external world, is more ideal or real. Communism begins from the outset with atheism, but atheism is far from being communism. Indeed, that is still mostly an abstraction. The philanthropy of atheism is therefore at first only philosophical, abstract philanthropy, and that of communism is at once real and directly bent on action. We have seen how, on the assumption of positively annulled private property, man produces man, himself and the other man, how the object, being the direct manifestation of his individuality, is simultaneously his own existence for the other man, the existence of the other man, and that existence for him. So here, just I can understand what he's getting at, but it's also said in such a way that its implications are, frankly, like just bad. So when he says, if you get rid of private property, the man produces man, himself and the other man. How the object, being the direct manifestation of his individuality, is simultaneously his own existence for the other man, the existence of the other man, and that existence for him. As if we are reduced to objects, that just because, suddenly a production is artistic, and I give you an artistic expression, of something within me, that I am now concretized, in my individuality is only existing in that way for that person, uh, which really can't be true. Partly because if I objectify myself within a piece of art, no other individual can really see it as me in the way that I see it as me. Only I really understand the emotions and the real work that goes into that, the real me that I poured into that. The other person can appreciate it aesthetically. I can explain it to them. I can tell them the story of what I felt in that, but they can't really see me in that, and they can't really just treat me as if they know me. That doesn't really work that way. It's reducing people to moments of objects, and then well, yeah, it has to be. Well, for me, no. As a matter of fact, it's a necessary problem because that's the problem of freedom. Look, if somebody's gonna be free from you, they had to have a measure of fundamental privacy, which is inalienable to them. That's part of what freedom is, and that's part of what the subjectivity is. It allows for this impossible to bypass block between individuals in which there must be a truly social relation which is based on trust and nothing but trust, a faith in each other, that we won't harm each other. And in the fact that people can keep that faith is one of the things that makes it a beautiful thing. Because, if we just did it naturally, well, it would just be it would, we wouldn't really value it any more than any other regular thing. But this is just weird. So, so man produces man himself and the other man. how the object, being the direct manifestation of his individuality, is simultaneously his own existence for the other man, the existence of the other man. So its existence, you create the object, the art, the artistic creation, for the other, but it also becomes the existence of the other, and that existence for me. I mean, so I think this can only be understood in a sort of artistic thing, in which a cultural creation which diffuses into other people, in which I create a cultural work, some other person consumes it, enjoys it, makes it constitutive of themselves. So, in creating cultural artifacts, artistic works which are consumed by others and then become constitutive of others, therefore, I have made the other person, and so that other person also exists as my own work to me. Yeah, 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 and so I mean, but at the same time, it has the problem of subjectivity, in which I don't think this is quite true either. In that just because someone can enjoy what you create does not mean that you understand the other person, because there's plenty of people that can enjoy what you write and have completely different reasons than you for enjoying it. Reasons which you might yourself probably despise, would not, would not consider and even despise. I mean, it happens all the time with artists. People end up liking their works and using it for ways that they never intended. So does that say something about you? Now that does that reflect upon you? Obviously not. It reflects upon them. Yeah, so then it doesn't reflect upon you, does it? So this is not exactly true. Oh yeah, yeah, but it doesn't really reflect. It socially reflects upon you, but it doesn't actually reflect on you because it's not what you actually expressed. Oh, sorry. Hold on. All right, hello. No, go ahead, say it. Well, it has to have a denial. It has to have a denial of a grand purpose that dictates our world. Yeah. So that yeah, so that religion definitely yeah, so that religion, atheism towards that, yeah, that's necessary. But atheism qua atheism towards religion qua religion uh, isn't necessary because really the all you need is the impetus, the material impetus for communism, and atheism against that kind of religion is necessary, but it's not necessary for religion in total. Well, yeah, like yeah, it would also have to be things like that, like things like Buddhism, things like Hinduism, also have their version of the Big Other, which is not active in the world, but which justifies the state of the world, and therefore people don't try to change it. So those kinds of religion, one must be atheistic too, or at least in denial of. And here, atheism cannot simply be an atheism of oh, I just don't believe in God. It has to be what I linked in on Twitter yesterday from the quoting from Blunden's little piece on why Marx wasn't an atheist, in which radical material atheism implies a hell of a lot more than just not believing in God. It implies, an active duty, an active undermining of the conditions of the religion, of what generates that kind of religion. So, continuing, likewise, however, both the material of labor and man as a subject are the point of departure as well as the result of the movement, and precisely in this fact that they must constitute the point of departure lies the historical necessity of private property. Thus, the social character is the general character of the whole movement. Just as society itself produces man as man, so is society produced by him. Activity and enjoyment, both in their content and in their mode of existence, are social. Activity and social enjoyment. The human aspect of nature exists only for social man, for only then does nature exist for him as a bond with man, as his existence for the other and the other's existence for him, and as the life element of human reality. Only then does nature exist as the foundation of his own human existence. Only here has what is to him his natural existence become his human existence, and nature become man for him. Thus, society is the complete unity of man with nature, the true resurrection of nature, the consistent naturalism of man, and the consistent humanism of nature. So this is alluding to things which I am not sure of. I haven't read Feuerbach, so I don't know what these things mean for Feuerbach. I know what they mean in Hegel, and they actually do make sense in a way with a Hegelian sense, but obviously Feuerbach was still influenced by Hegel quite a bit. And Marx here is trying to mix Hegel and Feuerbach. So let's review that more slowly. Likewise, however, both the material of labor and man as the subject are the point of departure as well as the result of the movement, and precisely in this fact that they must constitute the point of departure lies the historical necessity of private property. So a typical Hegelian point, the beginning is the end is the beginning. It's a more concrete example is capital begins as capital alienates itself through its various processes of production and returns to itself as capital, surplus value. So here, the material of labor and man as the subject are the point of departure as well as the result of the movement. So we begin with the material of labor, man as the worker, laborer. We begin with those. We go through a production process, and what do we have? Well, more object to labor, and men who have labored, or laboring men. So the whole point of society here is apparently the doing of labor, which is an arbitrary privileging within the circle of production, because it really doesn't seem to work that way, really. And the reason I say it doesn't really seem to work that way is that we don't really seem too enamored about labor as such, unless, by labor we expand labor to just be anything and everything that we literally practically do, in which case labor is a pretty meaningless thing. At least regarding any distinctions of labor, sitting on your ass and thinking is labor, walking around enjoying a sunset is labor. And if we mean by that, then yeah, the whole of existence is the reproduction of labor, for the sake of labor. We do shit for the sake of doing shit, but that doesn't say much. One could say that could just literally just be a tautology of freedom. So continuing, thus the social character is the general character of the whole movement. Just as society itself produces man as man, so is society produced by him. So, typical dialectical circle of development. Activity and enjoyment, both in their content and in their mode of existence, are social activity and social enjoyment. Which seems to me really nonsense, because there's plenty of shit that I enjoy that has nothing to do with it. Unless, we really want to stretch the meaning of society, just be literally, well, you couldn't have done that without society. In which case, well, sure. I just couldn't have gone out and enjoyed a sunset and thought, wow, that's a beautiful sunset, all on my own in the middle of the woods, without a whole social, cultural background. But it seems weird to call that social enjoyment or a social activity. It also seems to be that activity and enjoyment, both in their content and in their mode of existence, are social. I mean, it's kind of like, not making a distinction between the production and the product. I think there's plenty of things which we don't enjoy the production so much as the product, but we still, are willing to go through the production to enjoy the product. Yeah, there's plenty of examples in life in which we do that, and there's nothing wrong with that, I think. Like, this demand to make the activity itself always enjoyment everywhere seems to be, kind of like what Zizek, calls the modern imperative that you must enjoy. You can't not enjoy. If you're bored, yeah, it's a pressure to enjoy. Why can't you just be bored? Why can't just, no, you must enjoy being bored. It must be an joyful and boredom. No negatives are allowed. It's only positives, which to me, why aren't you enjoying flipping these burgers, comrade? Is this not the ultimate expression of your human individuality? Is not the burger flipping not the expression of your essence as burger flipper? Is this not your ultimate artistic production? I get enjoyment from fucking eating that perfect burger. All the homemade burgers I've made are just so much better than the shit I buy in stores, but I'm too lazy to make them at home. I put the whole shebang on them. So, continuing. Unless you have something else to say. The human aspect of nature exists only for social man. For only then does nature exist for him as a bond with man, as his existence for the other and the other's existence for him, and as the life element of human reality. Only then does nature exist as the foundation for his own human existence. Only here has what is to him his natural existence become his human existence, and nature become man for him. So this seems weird. The human aspect of nature exists only for social man. For only then does nature exist for him as a bond with man, as his existence for the other and the other's existence for him. He was a young kid. Like I think he was like what 27 or something when he wrote this. Probably younger, maybe 24, I think. Well, no, yeah, he was reading the Phenomenology Spirit at the time as well. He was rereading it, as they always say. So yeah, he already studied with Bauer. He had already studied with he'd already read Feuerbach. But yeah, this definitely obviously has to do with recognition. But he's talking about it with alienation instead. But even then, the human aspect of nature exists only for social men, in which I agree. Without literally what Hegel calls spirit, culture, you don't get these conceptions of nature as some kind of social other which you live with. But this does not require some sort of advanced communism. You literally get this in animism, basic primitive religion, basically, in which humans recognize nature mistakenly as really a living other kind of social being. The trees have communities, the animals, are nations according to Native Americans, for example, and nation has nothing to do with like states or blah blah blah. It's but yeah, they recognize it as a social other. That's what I was wondering. It could also be uh, the state of being, the nature of man. Yeah, so that was kind of like what I was thinking. Yeah, but like the thing is, it makes sense of both. But it like the trick things. I think he must be talking about nature as nature. For only then does nature exist for him as a bond with man. Uh, you know. Yeah, that's another way to make sense of it. I can see that. As his existence for the other and the other existence for him. And that is the life element of human reality. Yeah, so this would be like a conscious recognition of this. The human aspect of nature exists only for social man, for only then does nature exist for him as a bond with man, as his existence for the other and the other's existence for him, and as the life element of human reality. Only then does nature exist as the foundation of his own human existence. And that no recognizing, yeah, you're right. You know, and if he means, yeah, he's talking about human nature here. So only then does nature exist as the foundation of his own human existence. So his own human nature explains his own human existence. Why he's human in the first place. His nature is a social nature, hence a cultural nature, hence a communal nature. Blah blah blah. Only. So only then does nature exist as the foundation of his own human existence. Only here has what is to him his natural existence become his human existence, and nature become a man for him. Thus, society is the complete unity of man with nature, the true resurrection of nature, the consistent naturalism of man, and the consistent humanism of nature. Uh, yeah. So yeah, only then does nature exist as the foundation of his own human existence, and by nature here can only the social nature, which fully developed is society. Only society is the foundation of his own human existence. Only here has what is to him his natural existence become his human existence. That is, only then does society appear to him as his human existence, and nature become man for him. That is, society is humanity as such. Thus, society is the complete unity of man with nature, the true resurrection of nature, this consistent naturalism of man, and consistent humanism of nature. Okay, I think we squared out that paragraph. Yeah, pretty Hegelian. Section 6. Social activity and social enjoyment exist by no means only in the form of some directly communal activity and directly communal enjoyment, although communal activity and communal enjoyment, that is, activity and enjoyment which are manifested and affirmed in actual direct association with other men, will occur wherever such a direct expression of sociability stems from the true character of the activity's content and is appropriate to the nature of the enjoyment. Okay, so what I was saying earlier about the stuff about what he means by social here really is stretching it to the full limit of if it is in any way connected to being enabled by society, then it is to be considered social. So, walking around alone, enjoying a sunset is a social activity and a social enjoyment in that the only reason you can do that is you have an aesthetic conceptualization of things, given to you by a society which has a cultural history and, which has been enculturated into you as you grew up and, you have literally been molded by that very conception, that very society. You are basically an individual unit of concretized, congealed society. So, activity and enjoyment which are manifested and affirmed in actual direct association with other men will occur wherever such a direct expression of sociability stems from true character of this activity's content and is appropriate to the nature of enjoyment. I don't know. Well, I think that is one of the things he does. I mean, this whole point on enjoyment and satisfaction and realization, fulfillment. So continuing, but also when I am active scientifically, etc., an activity which I can seldom perform in direct community with others, then my activity is social because I perform it as a man. Not only is the material activity given to me as a social product, as is even the language in which the thinker is active, my own existence is social activity, and therefore that which I make of myself, I make of myself for society, and with the consciousness of myself as a social being. Uh, in which case, okay, that cashes out exactly what I thought he meant. He really just means it in this really, really broad, overarching term. Although I think there are cases, which what I said earlier, that by saying things are social, he just means literally if it was enabled by society, if it has any connection whatsoever to society, it's a social thing, whether it's done in private, alone, or not. Yeah. I wouldn't say it's. No, I wouldn't say it either, because there are ways in which this will happen in which it won't ever return to society. And yet at the same time, he's saying it is a social activity. No. No, I think like the phrasing on that is should be inverse. I think that it's in that it is comprised by the community that makes it social, not that it comprises, because it can go if you go out and enjoy like a sunset on your own and you never tell anyone and you don't write it down and it's just a memory for you, it's never going to come back to society. But it was comprised by society, therefore a social activity, and it was done as a human being, therefore a social activity. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be a part of the community, but it is a product of the community in that sense. Mm. Yeah, I think. Yeah, that's the thing. Like that's exactly the problem I have with it. That he stretch like this is Marx stretching society so far that it's meaningless, because society here just means literally anything and everything that has any connection to society, as if each point is to be identified with society in total, which is not true. It's a mistake, by the way. Hegel never does this, and people think he does. He does not. At least nowhere. I don't think I've ever read in all the things that I've read so far where Hegel does this, whereas Marx does it all the time. Because Hegel is so autistic about his terms and like letting you know the individual is not the universal, and the universal is not the individual, but they are identical in ways, but they are not actually identical as identical. Like they are not reducible to each other. So the individual, if you remove society and you leave one individual, you do not have society anymore. So continuing. My general consciousness is only the theoretical shape of that which the living shape is the real community, the social fabric. Although at the present day general consciousness is an abstraction from real life, and as such confronts it with hostility, The activity of my general consciousness as an activity is therefore also my theoretical existence as a social being. So this is one of those points of like the unity of theory and praxis, in which, you know, a theory should be imminently linked with activity. That if you don't have a theory that is immediately active, you know, it's worthless, it's an alienation, it's a figment, it's a spook, it's religion. But that too just is not true. There's plenty of things which have no theoretical purpose whatsoever at all. Does not give you any practical way of doing anything. For example, Hegelianism. Hegelianism at its core is utterly impractical and revels in its impracticality. In which, I mean, when Marx criticizes it for that, you know, I think he does so knowingly and rightly, for the very things which, you know, Hegel himself would not be ashamed of it, because Hegel thinks it's pretty. Yeah, Hegel's saying, look, I'm doing theory, pure theory, and that's how I like it, and that's how it should be. In that, for him, theory's point is just to be a practical theory of theory, not of physical material practice. You know, to have a theory of the state is to have a theory of how the state really is. Not as the state exists materially, but as the state really is eternally in concept. Yeah, what it ought to, yeah, or what it rationally is, if, yeah, and in that rationality, it is an activity, it is a practice. Yeah, it is an absolutely rational practice. So it is a unity of theory and practice. As a matter of fact, it's the most perfect unity of theory and practice you could ever get. It just happens to be the most useless because it doesn't tell you to do anything with the object. You can use it practically to do things to the material world, but that's not the end. That's not the aim of it. So pure theory, not necessarily bad, not unpractical, quite practical in theory. It's practical in theory. It's practically theoretical. So, well, no, but it's also the practice of theory. The true theory is also the practice of theory. Yeah, we're probably boring high ears. All right. So the activity. Yeah, go ahead. I wish that Zizek quote about him being like 80 years old in a wheelchair, and somebody asked him about, it's like, "Are you still reading Hegel?" Oh, that's so good. Yeah, the Harry Potter thing. Yeah. What was it that it says? Like, you know. Yeah. Like Hegel, like good philosophers are just people you can read your entire life and always find something new. It's amazing. So, anyways, to reiterate, the activity of my general consciousness as an activity is therefore also my theoretical existence as a social being. So, theory and practice, unity. That if I have a theory of society, it should be the theory that I live. Or, yeah, basically. Which, by the way, is also why capital is kind of amazing, because it's literally the theory that we live. It's a practical theory. Ha ha. It's a unity of theory and practice. Capitalism is definitely that. And capital. Actually, I just thought of that right now. Fuck. Yeah, pack it up, you silly left comms. We have the unity of theory and practice right here. We are living it, and it sucks. How's that for communism? Which, by the way, is a good critique, actually, of people who harp on this. It's like, we must have a unity of theory and practice. Well, how the fuck can you if you can't fucking have a system that you live? You can't have a theory that you can actually live that's not already systematic. It's not already there. Or you aren't already living it. I think Hegel's quite right in that you can't dream up the world before and then do it. Uh, you'll only find out what you lived until you've lived it and theorized about it. Only then will you have the theory of your practice. And only when you have an organic system of life do you have a system in which your theory, as pure theory, can also be the very thing which is your pure practice of living, whether you want it to or not. So continuing. Sounds like the left in general. They didn't let them organically develop. So continuing, above all, we must avoid postulating society, quote unquote, again as an abstraction vis-a-vis the individual. The individual is the social being. His manifestations of life, even if they may not appear in the direct form of communal manifestations of life carried out in association with others, are therefore an expression and confirmation of social life. Man's individual and species life are not different, however much, and this is inevitable, the mode of existence of the individual is a more particular and more general mode of the life of the species, or the life of the species is a more particular or more general individual life. That seems to make no sense to me. How an individual can be a more general thing, a more general mode of life of the species. I mean, we could speak of seems like it. Yeah, the only thing I could think about is like he probably means this in a really, really common sense, in which the mode of existence of the individual is a more particular, that is a more unique or more general mode of life of the species. One can be an artisan, or one can be a warehouse worker, which is more spread out, more general in these life of society. Wage workers rather than being self-employed, blah blah blah, that kind of thing. That's what I think. It makes sense in that way. Yeah, to say man's individual and species life are not different, however much as it's enabled the mode of existence of the individual is a more particular, more general mode of life of the species. Um, man's individual. Yeah, I mean, like here, I think, like thinking about this in like the regular ways that we mean these, and as opposed to the mangled ways in which Marx makes them mean things, and they are mangled because like what Marx means by species life and species of being and species essence, uh, really has nothing to do with what we normally would think these things would be have to do with. Because the species life is like, the species life. It's our biological being. We live. We have kids. We raise kids. We educate kids. We enculturate kids. Uh, yeah, that's kind of the species life. The species life is you grow up, you bang, you have kids. They grow up, they bang. You have families. Uh, Nothing else to it. The species life is just what we do biologically, what we biologically are primed to do. The social life is not the species life. It's the human life. Yeah, life produces life because that's just what life does. But we humans, yeah, but humans don't do that. As a matter of fact, humans end up choosing not to reproduce life because they just find it problematic or they just don't want to fucking deal with it. So it becomes subsumed to the cultural life. So I don't know. That last passage, beyond me what the fuck he's talking about. I don't know. Yeah, so yeah. Oh my god, don't get into the like pathetic virgins. Well, they are. I never cared. I'm about to be a wizard in 3 years. Well, yeah, but I don't care. Look, we know one person. I know one person from our group, and I know who it is, and his name has something to do with waffles. He doesn't know that, and he's the only one. He's already alienated from me, so whatever. I mean, it's. I never cared. I'm about to be a wizard in 3 years. I'm not despairing about ever that. Well, no, it's not ironically so, but I never cared. Yeah, that's what he wishes. All right, so The whole point was we agree that we don't know what the fuck he meant by individual and species life are not different, and the whole particular and general mode of life. It just doesn't make sense. Yeah, I don't know what the fuck that has to do with species life, unless he means society, in which case it still doesn't fucking make sense. Okay, let me take a stab at one interpretation of this fucking thing. So man's individuals and species life are not different, however much, and this is inevitable, the mode of existence of the individual is a more particular or more general mode of the life of the species. So this could be man's individual life, meaning forms of life, forms of society. So there are more particular and more general modes of life of the species, more different, more basic modes or more universal modes of life because they're more basic. They're more accessible to not so developed human beings. More particular, which are more advanced, more concretized. So the mode of existence of the individual is a more particular, more general mode of life of species. It's within that, and it's even more particular within those ways of life. Or the life of the species is a more particular or more general individual life, which is just another reversal of the same thing. That seems to make sense to me. But I don't think that's exactly what he's really saying either. Well, let's continue. In his consciousness of species, man confirms his real social life and simply repeats his real existence in thought, just as conversely the being of the species confirms itself in species consciousness and exists for itself in its generality as a thinking being. So, man recognizes his essence, his species being, and therefore repeats his real existence in thought. Just as And so, just as conversely, the being of the species confirms itself in species consciousness and exists for itself in its generality as thinking being. So, the essence finally accords with existence in consciousness and exists for itself in its generality, that is, its concept as a thinking being. So, man conceives of man as thinking social being. So, continuing, man, much as he may therefore be a particular individual, and it's precisely his particularity which makes him an individual, and a real individual social being, is just as much the totality, the ideal totality, the subjective existence of imagined and experienced society for itself, just as he exists also in the real world both as awareness and real enjoyment of social existence, and as a totality of human manifestation of life. So the first time I see this term totality, it's that paragraph. So man, much as he may therefore be a particular individual, is just as much the totality, the ideal totality. Well, no, he had read him, but he read him superficially. But he's wrong here too, by the way, because the particular is not the individual. Yeah, and since he's reading the phenomenology when he's writing these things too, And Hegel doesn't distinguish really the particular individual as such in the phenomenology yet. He uses it. Yeah, that's probably going way over people's head. Like the way to explain is simply the individual is the particularity of the particular. Well, no, because you can use that as literally a visual example. You put two circles and you say, okay, these are two particular circles, right? You point to one circle. This is the individual circle. Bam, particular of the particular. I guess, cause I don't know, like, dude, you say things, and even I who read Hegelese like don't understand what you say sometimes. You go over my head. Like if you told me that, like I would be like, what the hell? That's how we try. That's how we explain. We get better at it. So the continue going back over that. Sorry. Man, much as he may therefore be a particular individual, is just as much as totality, the ideal totality, the subjective existence of imagined experience society for itself, just as he exists also in the real world both as awareness and real enjoyment of social existence, and as a totality of human manifestation of life. And here is collapsing. Here he is collapsing the usual thing, identifying the universal with the individual particular. Can't do that. You cannot do that. It's actually it's something that if one took it seriously, it leads to dangerous consequences. Well, no, it leads to this whole. It destroys individuality because individuality can be only had in a difference with the totality. It cannot be identified with it. Yeah, it has to be individualized, but it cannot be itself the individual. Well, no, yeah. Once it concretizes fully, and you actually have the real universal, it automatically is an individual because it closes the circle. But that's not what Marx is getting at because that does not. Marx is getting at the collapse of the concept with its moments. You cannot do that. And that's the whole thing about totality. Totality is the concept, the individual is the moment. But if you identify the moment with a concept, you can't do that. So, for example, yeah, so there must be some sort of separating difference because otherwise you destroy the very thing you say you want to save. So, for example, to have a social human, you cannot have a purely social human. There actually must be something asocial about humans in order to have social humans at all. If you collapse the distinction, you got to have and it's I mean, it's come up. We have unconscious drives. There's a lot about ourselves which is just given by nature, but we couldn't be individuals if there wasn't that givenness, if there wasn't that differentiating factor, if there wasn't that thing which is not controlled by any sort of conditioning. Yeah. So, when he says the ideal totality is just as much as the totality, we got to make the distinction that man as particular individual uh, is a moment of the totality, is a necessary moment, an expression of that totality, but is not as much the totality. You can't make that collapse. And I don't know what he means by the ideal totality. Maybe. I don't know. It makes sense in a Hegelian sense of like moments. Yeah. I don't think that's what he means. I think he's talking about something else, but I'm not quite. Something more Hegelian, but I'm not quite sure. So the subjective existence of imagined experienced society for itself. So, the totality in the mind, or the totality as a thinking individual. Just as. So, just. Yeah. So, just as he exists also in the real world, both as awareness and real enjoyment of social existence, and as a totality of human manifestation of human life, in which, once again, the collapse of the universal and the particular cannot be done. Uh, he would have to say, as a manifestation of the totality of human life, but not the or a totality of human manifestation of life. So thinking and being are thus certainly distinct, but at the same time they are in unity with each other. Death seems to be a harsh victory of the species over the particular individual and to contradict their unity, but the particular individual is only a particular species being and as such mortal. So that just seems like a random point. Thinking and being are thus certainly distinct, but at the same time they are in unity with each other. Um, yeah, not really much to say about that. Definitely not a Hegelian point. I think he's taking the usual opposition of consciousness between thinking as that which is in my mind and being as that which exists out there. Yeah. So death seems to be a harsh victory of the species over the particular individual and to contradict their unity. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I don't think he's going into that. That's just going to Hegelian stuff. But yeah, that seems weird. Death seems to be a harsh victory of the species over the particular individual, and to contradict their unity, that is, the universal wins over the particular. Uh, the universal overcomes. Yeah, the species. I mean, in that the species continues through death and requires the death of the individuals. Apparently. But the species beats death. Yeah, but that's not Marx's point because he says, but the particular individual is only a particular species being and as such mortal, so there is no contradiction between the universal and the individual in their unity in death because that is the unity of life. Hello. Individuals die. All right. All right, so that's a break in the sections, and we'd be going for like an hour and a half. So I'm gonna cut it off because I don't know what the hell this other shit's about. Apparently, he just kept going and rambling. I mean, obviously these are notes, so it would happen. But yeah, we'll come back to this. Um, I gotta say, Marx is autistic, but it's the kind of autism that you get into when like you get grasped by an idea and you're like, holy shit, and you start thinking about it with everything, even though like it's ultimately nonsensical to do so because it turns things into meaningless, and yet you feel you've grasped something, and you gotta think things through with it to really cash it out. Yeah, yeah. So that's obviously what's going on. These are a lot of inspired musings of his. But yeah, I I can't say I actually learned that much about communism, but we'll see. There's another manuscript that I think has to do with more with like labor and private property, and I want to read that to kind of more find out what this distinction of private property and alienation is. And I think that's in the uh, the abstracts on labor. So maybe read those some other time. Well, yeah. We'll get around to that. But anyways, for anyone who listened to this, I hope you like the autism. I hope you like the Hegelian autism and the bumbling about. People say, is how do I learn things? How do I read things like this? Like this bumbling about. Well, no, how to like learn things? On their own. Yeah, how does one learn things like this? You read things. You're like, well, what the hell does this mean? And you reread it, and you think about it, and you talk about it, and you try to explain it, and that's how you learn. Like this is exactly how I read Hegel. Like all this bumbling about, it's how you learn. So yeah, get you some learning. Yeah. See you next time.